Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The person who kept insisting that I was nothing but a disappointment was the same person who had quietly rewritten the story of our family finances for years, and I only realized it fully on the night of her birthday. The whole family had gathered in the rented banquet room, the usual mix of uncles, cousins, old friends, and a few neighbors who liked being part of the performance. My mother loves being the center of attention, so she waited until the end of the evening to give her little speech. She smiled that polished smile she saves for guests and started talking about all the sacrifices she had made, how raising two children nearly broke her, how every dollar she spent was a dollar she had to earn twice. People nodded, clapped lightly, and then she turned the spotlight directly onto me. She said, word for word, that not a cent of her money would ever go to me because I had been nothing but a disappointment. She said it like she was reciting a line in a play, like she had rehearsed it for weeks, and the room went uncomfortably quiet for a second before people forced out awkward laughs. My brother smirked at the table, trying to hide it with a sip of his drink, and my stepfather kept his eyes down as if he had suddenly found the tablecloth fascinating. It was the kind of humiliation I had felt in private dozens of times before, but this was the first time she staged it publicly, and instead of making me crumble, something inside me just snapped into place. For years I had carried the weight of being the one who needed to prove myself. When my car broke down and I had to ride buses to work, she called it character building. When I worked extra shifts to pay for insurance, she told me I should be grateful I wasn't homeless. Every time I hinted that I needed help, the conversation turned into a lecture about personal responsibility. Meanwhile, my brother got a used car when he was 20 because he had potential, and later she funded his half-baked business idea with a temporary loan that everyone quietly agreed would never be repaid. I had watched this double standard unfold for so long that the pain became routine, and I almost convinced myself that maybe I really did deserve it. But that night, hearing her weaponize it in front of other people, I realized I wasn't actually powerless. I raised my glass, and I smiled in a way that confused even me because it wasn't bitter, it wasn't sarcastic, it was calm. I said that was perfectly fine, because I was moving overseas permanently. My contract was signed, my ticket was already purchased, and I would be leaving in a few months for good. At first, she laughed like I was bluffing, like it was a line thrown out in anger that she could swat away later. But when I held her gaze and kept my voice steady, the laughter around the room faded. People looked back and forth between us, trying to figure out if they had just witnessed a family joke or the beginning of something serious. She froze for a split second, and it was the most satisfying pause I had ever seen in her face. This was the woman who always had a retort, who never allowed silence because silence meant someone else was in control. The truth was that I had already lined up a remote job that offered relocation support, and I had been quietly preparing for months, right down to putting my apartment on the market. I had not told anyone because I knew if I did, she would find a way to sabotage it, or at the very least use it as fresh material to prove I was abandoning the family. That night, I simply took her power away by showing I did not need her blessing or her checkbook. The reaction around the room was divided. A cousin squeezed my arm under the table like she wanted to cheer, but didn't dare. My brother muttered something about me being dramatic. My stepfather cleared his throat and tried to move on to the cake, but no one really heard him. The air in the room had shifted. For once, I wasn't the one absorbing humiliation in silence. I was the one controlling the ending of the story. The rest of the evening went by in a blur, people making small talk, someone turning up the music a little too loud, my mother pretending to enjoy her cake while glancing at me every few minutes like she still couldn't decide if I was bluffing. I kept my composure, stayed for the expected photos, and even hugged her goodbye at the end, but my head was already free. I knew that moment marked the last time she would ever use her favorite phrase, "not a cent for you," as a weapon. I was not only leaving the table, I was leaving the stage she had built for me to play the role of the failure. What came next was even more shocking, because as much as she tried to dismiss my announcement, the truth started leaking out in places she couldn't control. The moment I walked out of that room, I felt lighter, but I also knew the fight wasn't over. I had evidence she didn't realize I had, and I had allies she didn't think mattered. Can you guess what happened next? I woke up the next morning with that heavy, odd mixture of relief and dread that hits after you finally say the thing you were never supposed to say, and even though my hands were steady while I made coffee, my mind kept replaying the expressions from the night before. The forced laughter, the quick glances, the way my mother's smile turned rigid like a mask that suddenly did not fit, and I realized that as satisfying as the announcement had been, it was only the opening move, because patterns like ours do not dissolve with one sentence. They resist, they twist, they try to reassert themselves, and if I wanted this to end cleanly, I needed to stop arguing feelings and start speaking in facts. So I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow notebook and began writing down the moments that had never made sense when viewed one by one. The medical bill that I covered out of pocket while my mother told me that adulthood means toughing it out. The winter when my transmission died and I spent weeks juggling bus schedules while she gave my brother a used car because he was under pressure and deserved a break. The spring she lectured me about responsibility while quietly wiring him money for a business idea that had no plan and no customers but apparently had hope. And as I listed these events in careful lines with dates and amounts to the best of my memory, I could feel the narrative change texture under my pen. Because for the first time I was mapping the double standard rather than drowning in it. I am not a person who loves conflict, and people like my mother thrive on that. They stay winning by forcing you to fight on their preferred battlefield where everything is emotional and subjective and framed as loyalty. So I kept my tone in the notebook the same way I wanted to sound to anyone who asked me about last night, calm and specific and almost boring, and it is amazing how powerful boring can be when the other side survives on drama. I listed the holiday where my brother received a paid flight to a bachelor trip while I was told that travel is a luxury for people who have their priorities straight. I added the months when I covered a small family emergency and never saw a thank you. And then I wrote a single line that I had never dared write before because it felt like a betrayal even inside my own head. This is not random generosity. This is a hierarchy. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Valerie, who has always been the one relative who keeps her voice low and her eyes open, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. She simply asked if I was all right and told me that the party clip had already started circulating in the family text threads, which did not surprise me, and then she added a sentence that made me put down my cup. Because she said that years ago there had been a custodial account set up in my name, and she had assumed it was still mine to use for school or for anything that would help me get established, and she had stayed out of it because it did not involve her directly. But given the way last night when she thought I should know and she thought I should look for the statements, I sat there for a full minute, not because I was shocked that there had once been some small college fund, lots of families do that, but because the existence of something that formal, something with my name on it and a custodian listed, would explain why my mother had always spoken about sacrifice with such pointed emphasis whenever I asked even the smallest question about help, as if any dollar directed toward me was an offense to justice, while dollars directed toward my brother were investments in potential, and now the possibility stood right in front of me that money meant for me had been redirected without my knowledge and then used as the measuring stick for my supposed failures. I asked Aunt Valerie what she remembered precisely, and she told me that she had signed as a witness on a document long ago when my grandmother wanted to make sure both grandkids had a bit of a start, and that my mother had insisted on being custodian for logistical reasons, and that this was all ordinary on paper, which would have been fine if ordinary had stayed ordinary, but she had never seen a statement in years. And she had never heard me mention using any of it, and that silence had started bothering her. She did not accuse anyone of anything, she simply said that paper leaves trails, and if a trail existed, I should follow it, not to light a match, but to understand what I was actually walking away from when I left for good. That afternoon, I pulled up my email archives and my old files and found nothing, which would have stalled me in the past, because I used to give up easily whenever family issues felt overwhelming, but I was not the same person who endured lectures and called it love. So I opened the family group chat where everyone had politely ignored the party video while texting about cake flavors and centerpieces, and I wrote a message that was both simple and nuclear in the way a single sentence can be, and I said that while I appreciated all the concern about my announcement, I was not asking for money, I was reconciling mine. And I attached a straightforward timeline of the support my brother had received with rough amounts and dates, and a note that I had done my best to be fair. I did not accuse, I did not rant, and I did not even mention the account, because I wanted the room to turn and look at the pattern before I introduced the proof, and the effect was immediate. A wave of quiet where the usual defenders lost their footing, because I had taken away the easiest dismissals, and almost right away my brother popped in with a defensive joke that only made him look worse. And my mother wrote me privately to say that broadcasting family matters was tacky, which I ignored. Because the only thing tackier than airing laundry is pretending there is no pile. By early evening, Aunt Valerie called and said that if I came by tomorrow she would hand me a folder she had kept for years without really thinking about it. A folder that might contain the missing statements and the original designation of custodian and beneficiary, and she apologized for not speaking sooner, which I told her was unnecessary. Because silence grows in families like ours, and you only notice it when someone finally cracks it open, and when I hung up I felt the kind of steady focus that comes from moving away from arguments and toward documents, and I realized that my announcement at the party had done more than freeze my mother, it had started a clock. I ended the night by setting a reminder to call a lawyer for a short consult, nothing dramatic. Just a clear conversation about how custodial funds are supposed to work and what options exist if they were used for purposes that had nothing to do with the named child. And as I turned off the lamp, I understood that I was about to step onto a path that would make some people call me ungrateful, but that is the label you get when you stop carrying a story that never belonged to you, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I did not need anyone to agree with me, I only needed the paper to speak. And it will. Because tomorrow I am going to see exactly what my name was attached to and who signed for it, and when I do, I am not going to shout, I am going to act. When I drove to Aunt Valerie's house the next day, I already knew that something fundamental was about to shift, not because I expected some cinematic revelation that would blow the entire family history apart in a single moment, but because I finally understood that the story I had been fed for years was incomplete, and now I had both the courage and the reason to pull at the threads until the missing pieces showed themselves. And when she handed me the thin manila folder that she had kept tucked away in a desk drawer for nearly 2 decades, I felt the weight of years of silence compress into a stack of papers that were not dramatic in appearance, but explosive in meaning. Inside were the statements from a custodial account set up in my name when I was still a teenager, and they showed deposits made by my grandmother and a few relatives who wanted to make sure I had a start in life. Something to draw from for school or for the early years of adulthood, and while the account had never been enormous, it had been significant enough that it should have mattered, especially during those moments when I was drowning in student loan interest or working overtime to keep health insurance active. Yet the statements told another story, because the withdrawals did not match tuition bills or living expenses that belonged to me. They matched dates when my brother suddenly had money for a down payment on his car, when he launched his short-lived business venture, and even when he moved into his first apartment and bragged about how quickly things were coming together for him. I stared at those numbers, each withdrawal carrying a date and an amount, and I could almost line them up with memories that had cut me in different ways. Moments when I had asked for help and been told no while he was quietly being funded with money that had been earmarked for me. The realization hit harder than any insult or public humiliation, because this was not about favoritism alone. This was about theft wrapped in parental authority. The kind that hides behind the excuse of sacrifice and fairness, but in practice robs one child to bolster another, and it was the kind of betrayal that could never be dismissed as just a misunderstanding, once the evidence was right there in black and white. I knew that rage alone would do nothing, so instead I made copies of everything, scanned them into a secure drive, and organized the statements by year with brief notes connecting them to the events in our lives. And it was astonishing how much clearer the past looked when it was stripped of the emotional fog my mother always deployed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. For the first time, I saw a straight line from generosity intended for me to outcomes that benefited my brother. And I realized that every lecture I had endured about independence and character had been delivered by someone who had already taken away the resources meant to support that independence. That evening I scheduled a consult with a lawyer, not because I wanted a lawsuit or a courtroom drama, but because I needed to know exactly where I stood, what the law said about custodial accounts, and whether the years that had passed since those withdrawals had closed every door or left a few still ajar. The lawyer listened patiently as I laid out the history, asked to see the scans, and then explained in plain terms that while some of the money was likely gone beyond recovery, the principle of misuse was undeniable. And that fact alone gave me leverage if I chose to use it. He told me that I did not need to fight with screaming matches or emotional appeals. I simply needed to document what happened and present it in a structured way, because people like my mother, who care about reputation and control, often cave when confronted with quiet facts backed by the possibility of legal exposure. So I followed his advice and drafted a certified letter that was not dramatic or cruel, but exacting, a letter that outlined the account, listed the statements, and stated the simple truth, that funds intended for me had been diverted without my consent, that I was now aware of it, and that I was open to a private settlement that would allow us to resolve the matter without dragging it into court or into the public eye. I attached copies of the documents and gave a deadline for a response, not because I expected her to comply immediately, but because I wanted her to understand that I was no longer playing in the arena of vague promises and shifting stories. When the letter arrived at her house, I know it landed like a grenade, because she called me the very next day, her voice a mix of fury and panic, accusing me of betrayal, of disrespect, of daring to question her sacrifices. But somewhere in the middle of her rant she made a mistake, and she admitted on speakerphone that yes, she had used some of that account for my brother's emergencies, and yes, technically it had been in my name. But she had always believed that as the custodian she had the right to decide how it was spent, and she insisted that it was all family money anyway. I did not argue, I did not shout. I simply let her words flow into the room, because sitting across from me at the kitchen table was a friend who had heard every single word, and as the call ended with her slamming the phone down, I realized I had just gained more than a folder of old statements. I had gained a confession. That night I sat in the quiet and let it wash over me, the sense that the narrative was no longer hers alone to control, and I knew the next step was not rage or confrontation but precision, because with both documents and an admission, the balance of power had shifted. She thought she could scare me back into silence with guilt and accusations, but what she had not realized was that silence was never my ally. It had only been hers, and now the silence was broken. The next move would not be about winning an argument at the dinner table. It would be about putting her in a position where keeping her reputation intact required giving me exactly what I asked for. This changes the rules forever, I thought to myself, because for the first time in my life, I had the proof, the leverage, and the calm to use them, and no amount of lecturing could put me back in the box she had built for me. And the real story was only beginning. When the call ended and the silence settled over my apartment, I realized that my mother had just handed me something she never thought she would. Because in her rush to scold me and to paint herself as the victim, she had confirmed exactly what the papers already suggested. And she had said it with enough clarity that anyone who overheard would understand the truth without me having to embellish a single word. For years she had lived in the safety of plausible deniability, insisting that I misunderstood, that I exaggerated, that my brother's luck was simply a product of his charm or his drive. But now she had admitted directly that she had dipped into an account in my name and had redirected the money because she felt she could, and in doing so she destroyed the story she had built to justify all of those years of selective generosity. My lawyer was almost casual when I told him what had happened, because from his perspective it was not an emotional bombshell but a practical gift. He told me to write down exactly what was said, to have my friend sign a short statement confirming that he had been present and had heard it, and to attach that to the file with the account statements. He explained that this combination of paper and verbal acknowledgement was enough to shift the leverage fully onto my side, and that I needed to think carefully about what outcome I wanted most, because at this stage I could pursue repayment. Or I could push harder and potentially expose her to legal consequences that she would never want aired publicly. He asked me if I was prepared for her to retaliate socially, with gossip or with half-truths on Facebook, and I laughed because she had already started doing exactly that before the ink on my certified letter was dry. Sure enough, within a few days I saw her posts framed in the language of the wounded matriarch, little paragraphs about how thankless children can break your heart, and how some people only see money and not love, and though she never named me. The timing was so obvious that even distant cousins could connect the dots. At first I felt that old familiar sting, the one that made me want to defend myself, to type long rebuttals or call relatives to explain, but then I realized that silence was more effective because every post she made without me responding looked like noise. And people began to notice the desperation in her tone. Instead of being painted as ungrateful, I began to look calm and measured, which is the one thing she could not compete with because her entire strategy depended on dragging me into emotional mud. I sent her a second letter, firmer this time, attaching not only the account statements but also the signed witness note confirming her admission, and I set a clear deadline. Either we settle privately by agreeing on a repayment plan and a written acknowledgement, or I file the documentation with the court and let the chips fall where they may. I did not yell, I did not threaten, I simply stated the consequences of her choices, and I included a draft agreement that made it clear I was offering confidentiality in exchange for resolution. The lawyer assured me that this was the best approach, because people like my mother fear exposure far more than they fear paying a debt, and the longer she resisted, the more damaging the outcome would be to her carefully managed image. The next week was tense in ways I had never experienced, because while she tried to intimidate me with long, emotional voicemails about betrayal and about how family should never sue family, she also began to send indirect signals that she was scared. One of those signals arrived as a counteroffer through her attorney, a half-hearted proposal that admitted financial mismanagement, without naming specifics, and that suggested a small one-time payment as a gesture of reconciliation. I almost laughed when I read it, because it was the perfect evidence that she had no ground left to stand on, and my lawyer told me to reject it politely and to hold my position. While all of this unfolded, something unexpected happened. People in the extended family began to call me quietly, some to ask questions, some to offer sympathy, and a few to tell me that they too had wondered for years how my brother seemed to always land on his feet while I struggled. I realized that the cracks in the story were visible to more people than I had assumed, but they had all stayed quiet because no one wanted to be the one to confirm them. By taking a stand, I had forced a kind of reckoning that rippled beyond me, and that gave me even more determination not to fold now that the truth was visible. The final push came when I uncovered another small but significant piece of leverage, one that had nothing to do with bank accounts, but everything to do with ownership. My grandmother, who had passed years earlier, had left behind a will that divided small shares of property among her descendants, and buried in that will was a clause that granted me a fractional interest in the family house that my mother still lived in. It was not a large share, but it was legally binding, and while I had never thought much of it before, I now realized it could complicate her financial life significantly if she tried to refinance or sell without my consent. With that in hand, I had a final card to play, and I knew she would understand the implication immediately. So in my third letter I mentioned it, gently but firmly, making it clear that if we did not resolve the custodial account issue through settlement, I would be forced to exercise my rights as a partial owner, which could make her life very uncomfortable in ways she had not anticipated. I did not frame it as a threat, I framed it as a practical consequence, but the meaning was unmistakable. Within days, she went silent, not because she had one but because she was calculating, and that silence told me more than any of her rants ever had. The atmosphere had shifted completely. For the first time in my life, I was not the one on the defensive, scrambling to prove my worth while being measured against impossible standards. Instead, I was the one setting deadlines, controlling the narrative, and calmly outlining consequences that could not be dismissed as emotional outbursts. She had always assumed that control belonged to her because she was the mother, because she had money, because she knew how to use shame like a weapon, but now she was staring at the possibility of losing more than pride. She was staring at losing control of her reputation, her finances, and even her home if she continued to push me. She went quiet for one long day, then another, and finally a third, and on the fourth day her lawyer sent me a counteroffer that was no longer dismissive, no longer arrogant, but instead edged with fear. And in that moment I realized that she was no longer trying to win, she was trying to salvage what she could. The story had turned, and I was holding the pen. When the final counteroffer landed on my desk, I read it 3 times, not because it was complicated, but because I wanted to feel the difference between the woman who once told me in front of a room full of relatives that I was a disappointment who deserved nothing and the woman who now, through her attorney, was agreeing to repay what had been taken, to sign a document acknowledging her misuse of the account, and to release me from the years of control she had disguised as care. It struck me in that moment that victory does not always look like fireworks or shouting or grand declarations. Sometimes it looks like a stack of signed papers and a quiet bank transfer that rewrites the balance of power without anyone needing to raise their voice. The agreement was simple but precise. She would repay me in installments that matched the amounts withdrawn over the years, and the payment schedule would be monitored by her attorney to avoid any delays or excuses. She would sign a letter stating that the account had been set up for me, that withdrawals had been made for purposes that did not directly benefit me, and that she regretted the decisions that had created the conflict. In return, I would sign a confidentiality clause that kept the matter private, and I would release my fractional share of the family house through a quitclaim deed, effectively giving her the clean ownership she had always assumed she held. My lawyer called it a balanced settlement, but I knew it was more than that. It was the final turn of the key that unlocked a door I had been trapped behind since childhood. I signed my name without hesitation, because I did not need to cling to her property or to drag her through public courtrooms. I only needed to reclaim what was mine and to show her that her old tools of shame and silence no longer worked on me. The wire transfer hit my account within days, and I remember sitting there staring at the numbers, not because the money itself was life-changing, but because it represented years of gaslighting undone by a single refusal to stay quiet. It was validation in a language she understood, the language of numbers and contracts, and I felt lighter than I had in years. With that money and the relocation stipend from my new job, I booked my flight overseas, finalized the paperwork for my new apartment, and began selling or donating the belongings I did not plan to take with me. Friends asked if I was nervous, if leaving everything behind felt too abrupt, and I told them honestly that the hardest part had already been done the night I raised my glass and announced that I was leaving. Everything after that was simply follow-through. My mother tried to arrange a farewell dinner to save appearances, but I declined politely, saying my schedule was too tight, and for once I did not feel guilt. I had spent decades attending events out of obligation, swallowing words I wanted to say, and playing the part assigned to me. This time, I chose silence on my own terms. The day I left, the airport was crowded as usual, announcements blaring, people rushing, but I moved through it with a strange calm. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket with messages I did not open, some from relatives trying to smooth things over, some from my mother alternating between guilt and anger, but I had already decided that once the plane door closed, my phone would go into airplane mode, and I would not be rushing to turn it back on when I landed. Aunt Valerie had sent me a simple message that morning, just a heart and the words, "Proud of you," and that was the only text I let myself read as I sat at the gate. When the boarding call came, I stood, took one last look at the terminal around me, and walked forward without hesitation. I was not running away. I was walking into a life I had built without her permission, without her money, and without her rules. For years she had believed that control came from dangling support and from deciding who deserved help and who did not, but what she never understood was that once I stopped asking, her control ended. That was the real victory, not the settlement, not the repayment, but the decision to stop performing the role of the unworthy daughter. As the plane lifted off the ground, I thought about how many years I had wasted believing I needed her approval, and I promised myself I would never again let someone hold my worth hostage in exchange for conditional love. I had turned the tables without screaming, without public scenes, and without becoming cruel. I had simply used her own rules against her, forced her to play in the realm of facts instead of feelings, and then walked away. What comes next is unknown, and that is exactly how I want it. I do not know how often I will answer her calls, or if I will answer them at all. I do not know if my brother will ever admit what he received, or if he will keep pretending it was all luck. And I do not know how the extended family will retell the story when I am not around to correct them. But I do know that when she stood at her birthday celebration and announced that she would never give me a cent, she believed she had delivered the final word, and instead, it was the opening line of the speech I never planned but finally gave. The last thing I remember before closing my eyes on that flight was the soft vibration of one final text arriving, and I never opened it. Maybe it was another plea, maybe it was another accusation, maybe it was silence filled with dots. It did not matter. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, the story ended not with me begging for recognition, but with me choosing peace. And that, in its quiet way, was the loudest revenge of all.